Now, NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio with Lee Witting, whether you're listening on TalkZone, by podcast, through the archives of our ad-free shows on our YouTube channel, or connected through our Facebook page. With the results of last week's national elections in mind, we should anticipate a renewed interest in utilizing religious denominations of all stripes in support of their communities, especially those denominations who have taken on an open and affirming inclusiveness. The reluctance of this new administration to endorse public funding for preschool childcare, elder care, meals for the homeless, and for nonprofit community programs generally suggests we'll need to renew those critical social uses for church communities. And one of the notable life changes many of those who've had near-death experiences make is to decide to leave their religious worship place for being too beside the point compared to their personal mystical experience. But really, the gift of their NDE was meant to be shared, and who better to share it with than a worship community overwhelmed with stale traditions? Now, as local denominations become islands of spiritual hope within their neighborhoods, wouldn't this be a good time to join or rejoin your worship community? It's an opportunity to share your energy and help, as well as sharing the insights you've gained from NDEs and other spiritually transformative experiences. The impending need for stronger church, synagogue, and mosque communities reminded me of an interview I did with Billups, a man who promoted NDE discussions at his church, despite never having had an NDE himself. Religious denominations will need spiritual strengthening for the road ahead. So much can be learned from Bo's experience in bringing the insights of NDEs to his own church community.
In my career as a hospital chaplain, as an experiencer myself, it's been easy for me to use my NDE in talking to those who ask me about what happens when we die. But what about chaplains and other counselors who have not had an NDE? Can they use stories from this rich source of otherworldly experience to assure worried patients about the immortality of the soul? Well, our guest today has been doing just that, and with notable success. Bo Billups, a non-NDEer himself, was motivated by NDE research to start a death and dying study support group at his church, moderate NDE book discussions, and search for a faith community that more fully reflected the lessons of the NDE. He believes we don't need to have an NDE to appreciate the profound life lessons they reveal. Moreover, Bo has observed that when exposed to NDE research and the personal NDE stories, some non-near-death experiencers are compelled to share their own unique spiritual experiences they have rarely, if ever, discussed before. The topic can also lead to a new openness to spirituality based on living without fear, living with purpose, and the true nature of consciousness. Bo is a real estate professional in Washington, D.C. He volunteers with organizations helping to promote action to limit climate change and prevent youth suicide. After college, Bo's first job was in Kenya, teaching English as a rural secondary school. Bo, welcome to NDE Radio.
Thanks very much, Lee. Good to be with you.
Bo, tell us, to start off with, how you became interested in NDEs and how it sort of led you in the path you're going in now.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting story. In 1976, I was 10 years old, and my dad shared with my sister and I this interesting book he was reading called Life After Life, and I decided I wanted to read it, and I ended up doing a fifth-grade book report on it to the dismay of my teachers, but it kind of started a lifelong interest in the topic, but it wasn't until much later and recently in 2007 when my UVA alumni magazine had a fascinating 30th anniversary kind of retrospective on the book Life After Life. Moody wrote it while he was studying at UVA in working with Bruce Grayson, the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies there in the med school, in the psychiatry department. And I started sharing that article with a lot of people. And it led to some really profound discussions about life and death and their own spiritual experiences. There was one conversation I'll really never forget with my aunt when she was in the end stages of a very brief fight with stage 4 lung cancer, where I shared this article with her. I had actually sent it to her just before she was diagnosed by coincidence. And when we discussed it, it led to a long, revealing conversation about her own spirituality that basically none of us were aware of. She was not religious at all, but I felt like the article was a way for her to reconnect to her spirituality at the end of life, and it led to a lot of other discussions with other people, my father, her brother, and other close family members. So I kind of then got motivated to share the information about the near-death experience with others, and that led to starting a death and dying study group at our church. It wasn't just about the near-death experience, but also about how folks can be more present at death and support those who are in hospice with books like The Needs of the Dying and other Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. We studied a lot of those different books, but certainly the NDE was a big part of our focus as well.
Now, you were, I think, as I understand, part of a mainline church at that time, mainline Protestant church, that wasn't terribly receptive to the notion of discussing NDEs as a part of their understanding of what happens when we die. So tell us, because I think this is true not just of that one congregation, but of many, many mainline congregations that I've encountered. Why do you think that is, and how is it possible to change that attitude toward NDEs?
Right. Well, first I'd say, as far as that church's attitude goes, it was a very progressive, open-minded church here in D.C., one of the largest Methodist churches in our Baltimore-Washington conference, and they were very supportive in terms of allowing us to explore these topics. I don't think not everyone was on board with the topic, or I think skeptical was probably the attitude of some, but one of the talks we had where we brought in a speaker, he was a former president of IANDS. 50 people came out of a congregation of about 800 or 900. So that was a great turnout. And my interest in finding a different spiritual home kind of grew out of the lessons of the NDE, where all people are divine. We're all going back to a source where there's no judgment, where we are actually judging ourselves in our life reviews, according to the NDE stories. And looking for a church that was more based on less of the doctrine and more on the principles of love and forgiveness that we find in the New Testament. In terms of why there's such a threat, and I think other churches are not supportive and even hostile to the near-death experience, that really comes from people being challenged from some of their core beliefs, where a very strict literalist interpretation, especially of the Gospel of John, would lead you to an us and them mentality, where if folks don't believe and adhere to a version of Christianity that's very specific to the most conservative interpretations, then those folks aren't Christians, and those folks are going to hell. And the NDE message is very different. I think the lesson could be that no religion has a monopoly on truth. That's what really is important, is not your dogma or your doctrine, but how you've loved and how you're expressing forgiveness throughout your life.
So that really could be a major stumbling block for many churches that believe that if you're not Christian, you're not going to heaven.
Oh, for sure. And I think not just if you're not Christian, but if you're not Christian the way they want everyone to be Christian, in terms of the need for a personal Savior is not present in all churches that are followers of Jesus. And I actually discovered Unity Church, which is a New Thought Christian church. There are probably about 1.5 million adherents to New Thought Christianity, according to Wikipedia, and it's based on the teachings of Phineas Quimby, who in the 1800s, mid-1800s, his writings led to the New Thought movement and consciousness, and Religious Science, Unity Church, and the Church of Divine Science are probably the three biggest denominations. And it's based on infinite intelligence, that God is everywhere, the Spirit in the totality of real things, true human selfhood is divine, so that since we're already divine, we don't need a Savior, but we do need a way-shower, and Jesus is the way-shower in terms of his example of love and forgiveness. That's what we believe at Unity.
Mm. So, as I recall, Quimby, I live in Maine, and wasn't Quimby a Maine resident as well?
I believe, I'm not sure exactly, and I looked on Wikipedia today just to make sure I had my details straight. But he's had a huge influence, and the founder of Religious Science wrote a book called Science of Mind, which has been a huge influence. And in fact, Louise Hay considers herself a science and mind minister. She became one in 1981. A lot of your listeners are probably familiar with her books, and her biggest one, You Can Heal Your Life, or Love Yourself, Heal Your Life, is all based on those philosophies.
Hmm. Weren't some of the ideas that Quimby espoused sort of taken over by what's the
Christian Science?
Christian Science. Yes, my mind went blank there for a minute.
Yeah, no, Christian Science, and its founder, Mary Baker Eddy, did base a lot of her teachings on his work. But it's considered different from New Thought because it's explicitly theistic and was a more clear attempt to reposition itself as a return to early Christianity in a way that apparently Quimby wasn't doing that.
Hmm.
But it was definitely significantly influencing Christian Science, its founder.
Now, did Quimby believe, or does the Unity Church now believe that Jesus came to save the world, basically, Christians and non-Christians alike?
Well, I think save the world is probably not how we would phrase it, in my understanding. And I've only been a member for 3 years, but I think Jesus was God's clear messenger of God's message of love and forgiveness. And so it was a revolutionary message. And there's no doubt about his importance as the number one historical figure in mankind, and that his message transformed man's relationship to God, but that we're really saving ourselves as we grow into our higher self with his guidance.
Mm.
So it's not a focus on Jesus as Savior, but Jesus as the way-shower, and really discovering the Christ within you, and that we're already loved beyond our wildest understanding, and it's that love that near-death experiencers experience in their NDEs, that when we're reconnected back to that somehow this is some kind of experience that maybe we volunteered for, and we come in soul groups to live out, to express God's love through our incarnation as spiritual beings having a human experience, in that famous quote.
The power of some of the NDE stories that I've read or encountered, firsthand talking to patients at the hospital, do tend to trigger in other people and family members or friends memories of some other kinds of spiritual experience that they may have had. Do you find this is true? And maybe you could tell us about some of those connections.
Yes, definitely. I think that's a common reaction. When people learn about the NDE and this amazing experience that many, thousands, I guess millions of people have had, although, not everyone's writing books about it. It's very common. In fact, I found most people know someone who have had an NDE when the subject is brought up, like, oh, yeah, my uncle had that, or my dad had that, or sometimes people say, I had that. I've had many friends tell me they had one. And at dinner parties, this comes up. I've been at a dinner party where the mother shared this and had never told the two daughters that she had two, each one during a difficult pregnancy, a delivery. So it's remarkable that people hold these stories back until they feel like they're given permission to discuss it when it comes up either in a book discussion or a one-on-one conversation. But that's exactly what happened when I was with my aunt at the hospital. And she wasn't very open to the topic when I raised the articles and the NDE, but then after a long pause, she said to me, did I ever tell you about the time when Stu came back to me after he died in a dream every night for 2 weeks? And she went on to explain this dream where she said, I was asleep, but I was awake, and the elements of the dream were very common in terms of what people share with those dreams that are not really dreams, where you're talking to someone, but it's like mental telepathy. They look beautiful, as good as they've ever looked, outlined in a white light. And the message from the deceased is typically, I'm okay and you're going to be okay. And don't worry about me. Live your life and live it with love. These experiences with the deceased are very common. In the U.S., surveys have shown that up to 50% of the population has either experienced a vision of the dead person and had a conversation, or has felt the presence of someone who's passed away recently. And so many people have had that experience, and those come up in these conversations that we have in the book discussions. When people share, most people have had something happen in their life that they can't explain and that stays with them very clearly, and are pretty eager to discuss it when they're given the opportunity. And I think it's a way to reconnect to their spirituality.
What do you suppose is holding people back from talking about these things? If there are 50% of the population out there who have in some way experienced a personal spiritual revelation, what is it? Is it churches that are repressing the discussion of this? Is it the basic scientific nature of our way of thinking these days that represses it? And how can we give permission to people to talk more about this?
I mean, I think the main thing holding people back is they don't want people to think they're crazy. They don't want to be embarrassed. And once people hear about so many other people having these experiences, and I think Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, the fact that he was a neurosurgeon, gave people, well, if this guy knows the brain that well and his conclusions are that his experience was legitimate and it's totally outside the realm of how medicine and physicians are viewing the nature of consciousness, then I guess it's okay for me to talk about, my grandmother when she came and sat at the end of my bed the day after her funeral. I think this stuff is very threatening to a lot of conservative churches that don't have any of this in their bandwidth. But it's real and it happens, and I think people are relieved to have an opportunity to discuss it, and that's been my experience with the folks who come to the book studies that I've shared. And in fact, some of those one-time book studies have resulted in smaller groups getting together on an ongoing basis as a book club to discuss these spiritual topics or just their spirituality in general, when people were kind of looking for another outlet besides traditional traditions, religious tradition.
It always puzzles me a little bit that people can say the the Bible is the only source of spiritual revelation, when, in fact, many of the people who wrote the Bible were either inspired by NDEs or automatic writing or a vision of some sort, the same sorts of things that go on even to this day.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Even Jesus' resurrection. I mean, that when he appeared to the disciples, which I think makes perfect sense, that this kind of ragtag group of peasants and fishermen were motivated to spread the Gospels and found one of the world's great religions. I mean, there has to be an explanation for that, and his resurrection would explain it, and his appearance to them. So it gives a lot of context to it.
Mm-hmm. In places where there's still a very strong faith, places in Africa, for instance, where Christianity has really taken off, you hear more of miracles and visions and even resurrections from the dead of people who've died and have been restored than you would ever hear in Western culture. And it seems to me that's not to say that that's all superstition in Africa and that we're more enlightened. It seems like maybe something is going on over there that we're not acknowledging over here.
Well, my time in Africa was very significant for me in terms of opening my mind to just in general. And Africa really stays in your heart, and it's a pretty special place where, so different from North America and Europe, where I'd spent a lot of time previously, that there's a connection to spirit, I think, in the non-Western world that we just can't appreciate, where their lack of possessions, our wealth and our cars, our big homes, everything we have in our houses, it weighs us down in a way and depresses our spirituality, that the developing world is completely free of that. That was my observation. And to this day, I've never met a community of people who were happy. No one's taking Paxil or whatever. There's no depression that I saw, but they have so little in the way of material possessions. I mean, obviously there's a lot of problems, and life wasn't perfect or easy, but there's a genuine happiness that I think comes from their spirit. That our modern...
I had the opportunity to spend some time in Ethiopia myself, and the people there were, and it's predominantly a Christian country, but the people that I met were so spiritual and so impoverished at the same time. But I always noticed on Sunday, no matter the fact that they didn't have washing machines or anything, that they would go out to their churches in the most dazzling, sparkling white garments, that they would somehow or other manage to really clean up for Sunday services because they believed that was the most important thing in their lives.
Yeah. And it's an all-day thing. I mean, it's not like an hour you're in and you're out, like a lot of our services. It's a real opportunity to celebrate who you are. I was very religious and conservative growing up, and I'm spiritual now in a way that I think as long as your religion is getting you to a point of spirituality, that it's putting you on a path where you're getting outside the boxes and you're growing, that's religion can be very good. If religion is keeping you in a box and preventing you from growing into your spirituality, I think that's a problem.
How would you say NDEs have played a part in the spiritual growth you've had?
Well, I mean, it's the whole reason for it. I think it expanded my mind and led me to what I feel like is a more genuine spirituality and healthier place where I think the bottom line is it's all about love and forgiveness, and his life was a perfect example of that. and not about us and them. We're all in this together. Unity, the name, we're all one, and all the divisions are phony. Race, gender, orientation, all that. We're all one from the same divine source, just in this human experience, and it's kind of like a big illusion that we're separate, but we're out of many, we're one. And I had been thinking about sharing my experiences through the book studies in terms of how non-NDErs respond to the information, and how I feel like it's an opportunity for people to reconnect to their own spirituality. I know a lot of atheists, I guess we all do. I always feel like the God that atheists don't believe in never existed. But that the NDE is a way for them to think about God in a new way. So I think most atheists, or people who are rejecting religion, are rejecting the brand of religion that is sending people to hell if you don't believe exactly what they believe.
Yes.
And that's why people become atheists, because they get so turned off by what they think is Christianity, or what they've experienced maybe in their own church. But that the NDE story can reconnect people, because there's elements that just ring so true, that it's about growing into your higher self, about living without fear, and about love.
And these are personal stories. They aren't dogma or rites or rituals coming out of a church. And there's nothing more powerful. Well, even Jesus knew that teaching by parable was a powerful way to convey an idea. And the NDE stories are so unique, even though they're so similar, that they're very moving on that account.
They are, and the range of people who are experiencing very similar things or lessons, or hearing the same things, are completely different. Like Eben Alexander, who was more or less an atheist or an agnostic when he had his experience. Mary Neal, who is a conservative Christian, relatively conservative, and I wouldn't say, she's a more traditional faith place. And then Anita Moorjani, who grew up in a polycultural experience in Hong Kong with a Hindu background. So everyone having such similar, compelling experiences, it gives people a lot to think about.
My thanks to Bo Billups for sharing his experiences introducing NDE studies to church communities. I hope this will encourage some of you church dropouts to work with similar communities to share your NDEs as well as your time volunteering. And thanks as well for listening. If you'd like to hear this show again, or any of our more than 500 archived, ad-free NDE interviews, go to TalkZone's NDE Radio site and hit the Past Shows button, or go to our YouTube channel, NDE Radio with Lee Witting, where you can subscribe to and comment on the complete NDE Radio library. And listen next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern at TalkZone, for more NDE Radio. I'm your host, Lee Witting, saying, once again, thanks for listening.